guest for today, at the age of 10, he fell in love with sneakers after seeing a pair of Air Max. Now, he is the founder and CEO of Street, the integrated marketplace connecting Asia's new digital generation with their authentic style of sneakers and streetwear. Before Street, he studied biology, finance, and started his career in a private equity at the Carlyle Group. As he ventured the entrepreneurial path, he was at Rocket Internet and helped launching and scaling startups in frontier markets in Asia. And during that time, he launched a startup from scratch in Bangladesh, scaled another one from 12 to 40 FTE in Myanmar, while monetizing it as well, of course, and ended up running a business across 4 countries in Asia. Listeners, help us welcome our guest for today, Gijs Verheijke. Hello, guests. Gijs, welcome to the show. All right.
Hello.
First,
Hi, Jackie and Wouter. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
thank you. Thank you for being here and for being our guest, knowing that you just had a new baby 2 weeks ago. Congratulations again.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's really an amazing year. A lot of life-changing stuff happened this year. It's quite hard to wrap my head around it, but I'm very happy.
Well, we're very happy for you too. Yes, thank you. And well, to just start our podcast, can you just tell our listeners a little something about yourself, guys, please?
Yes, of course. So the story about myself always starts with my name. It's a very difficult name to pronounce. Both of you have roots in Belgium, so you understand it, but it's a name that doesn't exist outside of Dutch-speaking countries. So it's Gijs or Gijs. That's how most people say it. I grew up in the Netherlands and didn't start my career in fashion at all. I got hooked on sneakers, as you said, when I was a kid, and got into this habit of buying way too many shoes. Um, and that has continued until all the way today. But I started my career in finance, in investment banking. But after a couple of years of doing that, I got a little bit bored of building Excel models and just looking at things from the outside. And I wanted to know what it was like to actually build a company in practice. You know, as an investor, you can be a little bit on the sidelines, and I wanted to be in the field. So I joined a German incubator called, or venture builder called Rocket Internet. And in Asia, well known as the backers behind Lazada, Zalora, and a whole bunch of other ventures in the region. And I basically told them, I've done my couple of years in private equity, and now I want to go on an adventure. I want to broaden my horizon. Send me to a country somewhere in Asia where and let me build a venture. And so they said, yeah, sure, you can go to Bangladesh. And I was like, yeah, that sounds perfect. So I moved to Dhaka in March 2015, and basically planned to be in Bangladesh for a year, and then probably go back and maybe go back to investing or do whatever. But ended up sticking around, moving from Bangladesh to Myanmar, and then becoming in charge of a regional venture, which meant I was flying around a lot between Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka, and really enjoyed. Sort of fell in love with the opportunity in Southeast Asia. It's a lot. Every country is so much bigger than the Netherlands, especially sort of like Indonesia and the Philippines, Vietnam. So there's a lot to do and a lot still to build online. And that was what I was learning at Rocket. So at Rocket, I was building mainly consumer marketplaces, so mainly job websites, but I was also on the sidelines kind of involved, and a lot of my friends were in sort of the other more e-commerce type of marketplace businesses. And I got completely fascinated with marketplaces and how they bring supply and demand together, and the difficulty with getting the whole thing started, getting the flywheel going. And meanwhile, of course, my sneaker addiction was going strong, and I was looking for a certain pair of sneakers, a certain pair of Adidas NMDs, and I couldn't get my hands on them. And I tried to buy them on on Carousel in Singapore, and it was such a disaster. You know, just dealing with sellers, going to an MRT station and waiting for a seller who was half an hour late, trying to figure out if the product is real or not. You know, just a lot of friction that I figured we could solve with a dedicated marketplace. And I had seen the wave of Gen Z coming when I was in Myanmar, and you know, the demographics in Southeast Asia skew so young that there's such a big part of the population that is young, and there isn't really a good platform for them to shop that's really made for them, and especially not in the sort of sneaker streetwear vertical. So I decided to go for it and raised funding and got started in 2019.
Whoa, and especially in Asia, when when you're looking for something original, it's even very difficult to distinguish original from a fake product. No, I can imagine.
Yeah, there's a lot more fakes here. We're closer to the factories, definitely. That's one of the
One of
definitely
the challenges that you.
characteristics of the region. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes, can you tell us what Ox Street is all about and what got you interested into this business or this entire industry?
So we started somewhere in the middle of 2019 and launched the business in November 2019. And we started just only with sneakers. And it was not really an original idea. Initially, we took inspiration from a couple of American companies like StockX and Goat, who are pre-existed, launched in around 2016. But we had the vision from the start to build something really for the Southeast Asia market, and really for the young people in the region that would span more than just sneakers. So over time, we've expanded to include clothing as well, streetwear, and we are working on a couple of things to make it more social. So I'm a big believer in that. Basically, Strava for X. Strava is like the social network for triathletes, right? For running and cycling. So I'm a big believer in the Strava for X type of model for the next 10 years, where you take a domain that has a very high passion among its users and where there's interesting content to be created. In the case of sports, it's obviously like your sports performance. In the case of sneakers and streetwear, it's more around sort of your collection and your outfits. That in those types of verticals, there are now, the internet is large enough to build vertical super apps. So you combine a transactional base with social, gaming, and media, and that's our vision for Ox Street, to build like a vertical super app for sneakers and streetwear.
Okay, so what are some of the main challenges that you have encountered with your startup?
So I think so. The main, I had a co-founder at first, but he didn't follow through in the end. So he got kind of cold feet. I got a job offer he couldn't refuse, and so I ended up being a sole founder, and that was probably the toughest challenge. I think it was difficult sometimes to deal with being the only, feeling quite alone and being the only person who has the full weight on his shoulders. And I think part of it was definitely self-inflicted, where I would really start beating myself up over something, and then ultimately after a few days speaking it through with an investor or with someone in my team, and then suddenly it became much easier. So it was also in a way a learning that even if you feel like you're just doing it by yourself, it's not necessarily true. Like you still have a choice at all parts. But I think that was the main challenge that drove every other challenge. And I think smaller sort of sub challenges were on the technology side. I really, one of my frustrations from my Rocket time was that you have no control over the product at Rocket, and the products aren't usually very localized. And so I felt it was definitely something that could be done better. But then with Oxford, it turned out to be very difficult to do it better. So in the actual execution of it, we had quite a lot of roadblocks. And now that we've become part of Carousel, one thing that they've been saying is that they're actually quite impressed with what we've built on the product side and with so limited resources. And that was really something that made me think like, wow, okay, interesting. That's a nice thing to hear, because I always felt that we were so bad at it, basically, and under executing. But it turns out we just never really had the resources to really do it well. So yeah, it was just your usual ups and downs. We almost ran out of money a couple of times, but that's just par for the course. I think generally we had our fair share of good luck and not a lot of bad luck. So it's been a very, very interesting journey of learning. And I always feel like in these kind of situations where you have a lot of skin in the game and you really challenge yourself, you learn the most. It's like compressing 10 years of a normal job into 2 years of learning. So I'm very it's been a hell of a ride, a very worthwhile ride.
What made you partner up with Carousel? And what are some of the lessons you learned along the way?
And this is the same Carousel, right?
Yeah, I mean,
his was looking for sneakers at Carousel.
The same,
before,
yeah. So we're bringing it home effectively. Yeah, so I mean, so Carousel is the still by far the number one sneaker trading app in Asia, but it's still completely unstructured, right? So anyone can post any sneaker. It doesn't have to be real. And so the challenges that we identified on Carousel and the reasons we started Oxstreet were bringing more trust and taking the hassle out of the transaction. And Carousel has seen over time that the biggest barrier to more adoption of secondhand is the fear of lemons. So the fear of buying a product that is not up to scratch, that is somehow broken or inauthentic. And it's a big priority for Carousel strategically to add more and more trust and more value to the transaction. So for them, it's really an acquisition of capabilities in end-to-end and in sort of this end-to-end marketplace way of working, where you actually add the maximum amount of trust to the transaction, where it almost becomes like an e-commerce experience. So that's the rationale of it from their perspective. I think how it happened is it actually goes way back, where I had been introduced to a couple of the founders of Carousel years ago, and that was when I was still living in. I spent a couple of years on Bali in between Rocket and Oxstreet, just figuring out what to do next and consulting with all kinds of companies. And that's how I knew vaguely some of the Carousel guys. And then I ended up doing a project for another company called 701 Search, which was a Telenor-owned company running general classifieds marketplace in Malaysia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. And I worked with them for quite a bit during 2019. They were paying my rent while I was starting Oxstreet. So then that company was acquired by Carousel later in that year or maybe the next year. So in a sense, it turned out I had quite a few friends within Carousel, and we started talking about how we might work together. In particular, how we might, as Oxstreet, add sort of white label authentication to some of the categories in Carousel. And we never really could bring it all the way home, because there's a bit of a conflict of interest there, because if the transaction happens on Oxstreet, we make the fees, and then, authentication, how would we price that if we do that as a service? And around that time in 2020, we still had a lot of excess capacity. So we were like, yeah, doesn't really matter. We'll just do it and see what kind of traction drives for us. But then when we started picking up that conversation again somewhere in May or so of 2021, we had actually grown a lot. So we didn't have any excess capacity anymore. So the discussion became like, okay, if we are going to do authentication for Carousel, we will need to hire specifically people for that. So how are we going to be assured that we'll get the volumes? And so we just couldn't get through that conversation all the way. But meanwhile, we kept talking and realizing that we had a very, very strong shared vision for how to build a company and how the future could look for e-commerce and for more high trust ways of buying and selling secondhand. And I was raising a new funding round, and I spoke to the CEO of Carousel, and at one point I said, why don't you just participate in the round? Just invest in this funding round, and then, this conflict of interest goes away. And he was like, okay, that's actually a really interesting idea. And from there, the seed was planted, I guess. And then rapidly we came to the conclusion that it was actually the only way to really solve the conflict of interest, and the best way, the most value maximizing and most powerful way to go about things would be to fully come on board with Carousel. And I have to say, at first I was a little bit like, we're sort of selling our baby, right? A bit bittersweet, but I love Carousel so much. Like I said, we go quite a while back, and I think it's an awesome company with great leadership and great prospects. So I was quick to come around to the idea, and ultimately, we managed to bring it over the finish line quite quickly in a couple of months. So that's how it goes. I think the main lesson about it is that you can't really sell your startup. You get bought. It happens on the timeline of the acquirer. So when we first started speaking with Carousel, it was a year ago, right? And I sort of pitched the idea of working with them or maybe them acquiring us, and it took a year for it to finally happen because the other stuff gets in the way, right, for the buyer. So it was a good situation that it just kind of happened at a good time.
So now that you've sold Ox Street, what are you planning to do next? Are you planning to do more with Ox Street, or are you planning to venture into something new?
Yeah, no. So we're continuing to build Ox Street. So one of the coolest things about this acquisition is that we get to keep Ox Street as its own brand, and really keep building it as we keep building the original vision. So I'm still CEO of Ox Street. We're building out the team very aggressively across the region. We finally have the budget to make the senior hires that we want to really take this thing to the next level. So it's still actually the best situation where we have, more stability, and we don't have this existential moment of running out of money every 6 months, 6, 7, 8 months. But we still have all the benefits of building, all the fun of building. And for me, it's ultimately mostly about the building, right? I just love to build stuff with other people, and that's what we still get to do.
And what I find so amazing about this is you mentioned you started Ox Street in 2019, and this was even just like at the just right before the moment of the pandemic. Did that create did you have any hesitations, Gijs, or any worries at that time, or were you just confident that your idea would get through even in the midst of a pandemic?
I mean, it was a bit. First, you kind of wait and see, and we were actually raising funds in February, March of 2020, and the funding landscape completely shut down for a month or two, and so that was quite tricky for us. We almost ran out of money, but our existing investors backed us, thankfully. But we actually saw quite a significant uptick because people were stuck at home. They were not traveling. Different countries had different types of stimulus checks that mostly went into consumption. You can see right now it's sort of like the inflation starting to come in. People have been spending like crazy on all kinds of stuff. And there was a massive shift to online shopping that definitely benefited us. So for business, it was actually pretty good. Another interesting dynamic was that during the lockdowns, people were very, very discouraged from meeting up. So Carousel, which you've mentioned now so many times, was not really anymore a feasible way to buy and sell sneakers because the default way is to meet with a stranger to trade. And so we had that end-to-end capability, and so we were able to gain market share through that. So yeah, it was for us business-wise. It was actually pretty positive.
Amazing. Just isn't that just amazing? And well, talking about the beginnings of your business, Gijs, and you mentioned earlier that with any startup, actually, there's like a shortage of manpower. Were was there a point where you thought about outsourcing?
Yeah, we've outsourced different things. We've outsourced design. We've outsourced programming at different points for different projects. And we've outsourced performance marketing, advertising. We've worked with freelancers for SEO at different points of time. So, yeah, I think for us, um, free, hiring freelancers for projects is quite a established way of solving problems when needed.
And do you think, having been through that process, do you think it's a wise choice for startup companies to consider?
I think it's a very double-edged sword. So I definitely not for
Core.
very critical things, right? So because if you're an early stage startup, I don't think you can outsource your tech, for example, because you really need to be able to pay with equity for a programmer that really wouldn't work for you if you were to have to pay them in cash, right? Your most valuable asset is the equity that you have in your startup, and outsourcing freelancers typically don't want to work for options, right? So that's a no. But if you have the people in place that can manage the streams, or if you have someone who is a co-founder on tech, then what we've done, for example, is there was quite a discrete part of the platform that needed to be built, um, which was a certain solution for payments. And for that part, we hired a freelancer who is an expert in that, right? And that's fine. That's great because you can hire someone for just a couple of weeks or months that it takes to build that part. So that I would highly recommend. And then if there's something that is just not so critical for your company, in our case, it's online advertising. It's not the best channel for us to grow, but it's something that we still have to do. If you were to hire, it's just not a full-time job for us. So if you were to hire a very good full-timer for that, you would just be wasting additional money. So that's another very good reason I feel to outsource. We have plenty of other examples of that. Photography, um, the occasional launch video, right, where we have to make a video that's a bit more in depth. That we would never hire that. There would be no way to do that without outsourcing. So those are the kind of things that I would definitely recommend every startup to do.
And now that and thank you for that, Gijs. Now that you're part of the Carousel group, with the with more resources that you have, is outsourcing, are you still thinking about outsourcing some of your competencies, or do you think that what you have within the group is already enough, considering that now you can hire top talent if you would want to?
Well, I think on the marketing side, definitely we will continue to outsource um, certain parts of it. So the question becomes, what is our core value add, right, as a company, and what do you want to do in house? Um, I think that clicking the buttons in the Facebook Ads Manager is not necessarily something you would want. You would need to have the overhead of the quarterly review, someone needing a raise, that kind of stuff, right? So that part, hopefully, we can continue to outsource. And then on design and photography, the same rationale applies as it has, right? We just not going to need a full-time videographer for right now. I think finance is another good one that we've outsourced from the start, right? Finance, tax, payroll, that kind of stuff. You should definitely not do that as a startup founder. And that part we will partly probably continue to outsource, but we'll probably migrate in time to the same providers that Carousel uses. And part of that will be taken up by their teams. So it's a mix, but I think honestly, every size company will probably have outsourcing as a part of their employment mix.
Since we're running out of time, one very important question to us and our viewers is there are a lot of eager and aspiring entrepreneurs out there. What would be your key advice to them based on everything you have learned in the past couple of years?
Yeah. I think like people always act as if starting the business is the hard part, but that's actually the easiest part, right? You just incorporate and you open a bank account and you're off to the races. And then also after that, coming up with the first wireframes, coming up with the brand name, the logo, all of that stuff is really, really easy compared to what comes next. I think the difference is made, and the hard part is getting from that first concept to then realizing that in 90% of the time it's not working at all, and it's totally different than you thought, and then have the adaptability and the execution, consistency and strength to navigate through that part of not having product market fit and finding product market fit. That's the hard part, and that's where most startups that don't make it, they will probably fail in that part, right? And that's also where we came close to not making it a couple of times, of just, everything you try, it doesn't work, right? Time and time again, it just doesn't do anything. That's pretty hard, and pretty frustrating. So yeah, you need to have some perseverance through that part and keep iterating on your idea. And I think that also comes back to the number one advice, which is very cliche, but you better find an idea that you care about and you don't mind working on for a couple of years with very little pay, because it's going to take a while, probably, and you really have to care about the problem and the customers you're serving. Otherwise, it's going to be too hard to keep from burning out.
Wow, and you definitely have something that you care about, considering that when you were 10, you already fell in love with the Air Max. But what was in the Air Max case that that connected with you?
The visible air. It was unlike any other shoe, and that was just like, wow, that's you're walking on air and you can actually see the air. That I must have that. It was very simple. I was 10. I wasn't very sophisticated. More sophisticated than that.
But here you are now, and you're probably also going to deliver a lot of these type of sneakers to a lot of happy Gen Z and millennials, and the rest of the people in Asia, and hopefully expanding to Europe.
Yeah, and even beyond. Exactly. I think we have an amazing platform now with what we've built so far in the past 2.5 years, plus the Carousel platform, which is crazy in scope and size, and it's really exciting now to start working with them and with the amazing people at Carousel, but also the amazing people that we are now going to hire, right? It's really cool to take this to the next level. and see how far we can fly.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Gijs, for your time. And we're running a bit low on time now. So that's all for today's episode. Thank you for listening. And yes, we wish you a lot more luck and success with Street and Carousel and in your future business endeavors. And we've learned a lot from this session. Thank you. And once again, this is Jacqueline de Monk.
And this is Wouter Del Bare.
And stay tuned for the next episode of Mangtas Nation.